Andrew Wommack Ministries presents Part 3 in Don't Limit God, a 6-part series. This teaching by Andrew is titled Fear of Risk. We pray that the Word of God will come alive in your heart as you listen.
The Lord spoke to me January the 31st, 2002 through Psalms chapter 78 and verse 41. And it says there that they turned back and tempted God and limited the Holy One of Israel. And God spoke to me through that and said I was limiting Him by my small thinking. And so I've been talking about this, and the bulk of what I've been saying is just trying to let people know that God has to have our cooperation to bring His will to pass in our life. And we don't always cooperate. We limit God. You know, a verse that I often hear people quote is Ephesians chapter 3 verse 20 that says, "Now unto Him who is able to do exceeding abundantly above all we ask or think." And they just talk about how God can do anything. He can do exceedingly abundantly above all we ask or think. But did you know that that's not what that verse says? If you take the whole verse, it goes on to say, according to the power that works in us. The word according to means in proportion to, or to the degree of. God is limited to how much we cooperate with Him. It's not our holiness, it's not our goodness. God is a God of grace. He doesn't just give us what we deserve. He's never had anybody qualified working for Him yet. There is forgiveness and grace, but we do have to believe. We do have to cooperate. Isaiah chapter 1 says, "If you be willing and obedient, you shall eat the good of the land." And we have to cooperate with God. What I want to share with you today is some other things that were hindering me, and I wasn't even aware of it. If you would have come to me prior to God speaking to me and revealing this and opening my eyes, I would have told you, man, we were believing God because our ministry had doubled in 2 years period of time. I had been in the ministry for 34 years, but in the previous 2 years, it had doubled over what it had been 32 years taking me to get to this place, and then we doubled. So I thought, man, we're doing pretty good relative to what I had done in the past. But the Lord told me that I was limiting Him, that He had much more for me. And I've given some of these stats, but man, it has proven to be true. Our ministry has increased over 15 to 20 times what it was since the Lord spoke this to me, and we are seeing awesome things happen. But here's some other reasons. I've already talked about that I was just lazy. It was the cares of this world. I was just enjoying the relative ease of ministry, and I didn't want to put myself back under the gun again. And so I've already talked about that. But here's another thing that I believe hindered me, and I believe it's a hindrance to most people, and that is a fear of change. People resent change. They like things to be stable. They don't like the unknown. They want everything to be just the same. I've actually seen people before who had physical problems, but they had adjusted to it. And they would rather stay in the state that they were rather than to change and face possible failure and the unknown. I can think of one guy when I was in Seagoville, Texas. He had been a sheriff, and he had been shot. And because of that, he was paralyzed in his legs. And anyway, I ministered to him, and I prayed with him, and he had had an operation, and I forgot it was some kind of a gallbladder surgery or something, but they had a tube in him with a bag, and this operation was draining. He was sitting in a wheelchair, and I prayed with him, and he had been totally paralyzed in his legs. And I prayed with him, and he got to moving his legs and kicking his legs. He hadn't done that in, I forgot, 20 years or something like this. And so, anyway, I said, well, get out of that wheelchair. And he says, I can't get out of that wheelchair. I've got this drainage. I've got this bag, and if I was to stand up, you know, they've made it so that I'm sitting down. If I stood up, that tube would come out. And this is back when I first got started in ministry, and so I just said, okay, whenever you get the tube taken out, then you get up and walk. Now I'd probably, you know, have him stand up and stick my finger in a hole or something. But I'm a lot bolder now than I was then. But anyway, I just let him go. And over a period of weeks, when he finally got the tube taken out, he was still in the wheelchair. And I went over and ministered to him, and he was paralyzed again. I prayed with him and his legs began to move, but he never would get out of that wheelchair. So it's a long story, but finally I had another guy who was more mature in the Lord than me, and he went over and he just discerned that this guy, even though God had manifested healing in his body, he didn't want to get out of that wheelchair. And that just shocked me. It never occurred to me that anybody would want to stay in a wheelchair. And anyway, he just got in this guy's face and he says, if you really believe God and if you want to be healed, you come to church tonight. And the guy said, well, I got something to do. And he says, no, you cancel whatever else you're doing. You come and you can get up and walk. Anyway, the guy didn't show up at church and the other guy left. So afterwards, I went back over to his house and I was talking to him and I said, why aren't you getting out of this wheelchair? I've seen God heal you. Your legs move. Why aren't you doing this? And the guy finally broke down and cried. And he said, I used to be the sheriff and I got shot and that's what caused this paralysis. And I'm on disability. And people honor me because I was hurt in the line of duty. And he says they respect me and they do all this. And if I got healed and got out of this, I'd lose my disability. People wouldn't honor me anymore. They might think that I was faking it this whole time. And anyway, because of these things, he would rather stay in a wheelchair. And he did. He stayed in the wheelchair because he would rather do that and have the respect of people and a government check coming rather than to be healed and to get up and have to do things. There's a lot of people that are in bad situations that have just adjusted to it and they would rather stay there and suffer than to run the risk of change. I tell you, I do not understand that. I think that is an ungodly attitude. Yes, there is a possibility of failure. Yes, if you start believing God for more and you start taking the limits off God, you know what? There's the unknown. What's going to happen? If you were to take everything and just put it all on the table, instead of saying, God, I'll serve you as long as you don't send me to Africa, as long as you don't have me become a pastor, as long as you don't tell me to go to Bible school, or as long as whatever. But if you just put everything on the table and say, God, it's all here. I'll do anything. I run up a white flag. Whatever you want. I'll do whatever you want me to do. You know what? There is a possibility that God is going to have you do something that you don't want to do. And some of you, see, are just afraid of that. But I can promise you this. It says in Psalms chapter 37, verse 4, it says, delight yourself in the Lord, and He will give you the desires of your heart. That doesn't mean He'll just give you whatever you lust for. If it's another mate, if it's $1 million home or whatever. No, it's talking about you delight yourself in the Lord and He puts His desires in your heart. He will change the desires of your heart. And if you truly commit yourself to the Lord, God's not going to ask you to do something that is just terrible to you. It may be something that in the natural you never would have thought of and you wouldn't have done, but once you commit yourself to the Lord, you'll love it. I've actually used this example before, of people saying, oh God, you're going to send me to Africa and make me live in a grass hut. And one of my friends, he came to me and he said, I grew up in a grass hut in Africa. And he said, it wasn't bad. He said, we had the nicest grass hut in the whole village and stuff. And people talk about how terrible that is. But, I've got people, we've interviewed them on our television program. Dottie Heyman is a woman who's in Kenya. And we had her on my television program not too long ago. And we put out a video of her. I've had so many people blessed by this video. But Dottie Heyman is a woman that I don't know how old she is, but I'm sure she's as old as I am, around my age or something. And when she was in her 60s, she left everything in the States and went to Kenya. And when she got to Bungoma, Kenya, she only had $100 left. She had no return ticket. She's been in Kenya for 11 years and has never come home, isn't planning on coming home. She went over there and yeah, God sent her to Kenya, but you know what? She is making an impact. She's got, I forgot how many, over a dozen kids now that she feeds and takes care of. She's got dozens of widows. She's making an impact all around the world. And Dottie, she puts out a newsletter and she'll just say, I'm the most blessed woman on the planet. She says, I'm so happy. Her life is fulfilled. God made her love what she's doing in Kenya. And I've been to her home there. And it's a nice home. It's nicer than many of the homes around, but it's not as nice as what most of us have in the States. But you know what? She loves it. It's what God has put in her heart. I'm just telling you that if you are afraid of change and you're afraid of what God's going to do, that will limit God. You don't need to say, God, I'll serve you as long as you never make me do this. You know, that's not making Jesus Lord. If Jesus is truly your Lord, then He's God and you aren't. And just whatever He tells you, that's fine. You just do it. You do it. It doesn't matter if it looks like it's going to cause problems. You just do it. And you have a confidence that God loves you more than you love yourself. God's plans for you. I used this the very first day I started teaching on this in Jeremiah chapter 29, verse 11. I know the thoughts that I have towards you, says the Lord, thoughts of peace and not of evil, to give you an expected end. God's plans for you are better than your plans for yourself. And if God calls you to go to Africa or go to who knows where, it'll be because He put that desire in your heart. And He's not going to do things to hurt you. He's going to do things to bless you. You'll be happier in the will of God than you'll ever be outside of the will of God. So, one of the things that limits what God can do in your life is a fear of change. And you want everything to be stable. You want everything to be predictable. You know what? A godly life is not predictable. I was talking to somebody just the other day and I was saying, man, isn't it exciting serving the Lord? Because I mean, God, it is, if you're bored, I can guarantee you, you are not in the center of God's will. When you're following God, it's challenging. God is, I mean, He's constantly going to have you stretching out there and believing for things and putting yourself in a position where if God doesn't come through, you're going to fail. You know, I think that there's a lot of people that when they evaluate what they want to do with their life, they only plan, they only have goals of what they can do. But God is going to call you to do something that is beyond yourself. I remember a couple that went over to, the first couple that went over to Australia and started our office and our Bible school over there. I was in Australia with them and we were going to start a service that night and we were going to announce the beginning of the Bible school. And this man came to me just an hour or two before the service and he says, I've got to tell you, I don't think I can do this. This is bigger than what I'm able to do. And he says, I think I'm going to have to quit. I'm going to have to bow out. I can't do this. And he waited for my response and I said, that's great. And he was shocked. He says, what do you mean that's great? And I said, as long as you don't stop there and let your inadequacy stop you, I said, well, then that's great. It'll make you depend upon God. Call out to God for help. And I said, as long as you don't stop there, if you go beyond that and say, God, I can't, but through Christ, I can do all things. Philippians chapter 4, verse 13. I said, you're the exact person we want. And you know what? He and his wife started the school and the ministry and did a great job. And we saw great things. We now have another director over there. But they were a blessing for a long period of time. And God used them. I'm telling you, God is going to call you to do something beyond yourself so that you have to depend upon Him. If you're only doing things that you feel qualified to do, then I can guarantee you, you have not found God's will for your life. If your dreams and visions don't wake you up at night, you're dreaming too small. God is going to call you to do something that's beyond yourself. Man, that's certainly true with me. I was an introvert, couldn't look at a person in the face and talk to them, and now I talk to millions of people every day on television. God called me to do something that I had to get beyond myself to do. And I could just go through the Bible and show you person after person after person. Every one of them felt disqualified. And yet they learned how to trust in God. God is going to call you to do something bigger than yourself, something that is beyond yourself, so that it makes you depend upon Him. You know, when we have access to God and all of His power in our life, to live a life that is only humanly possible, it's stuff that you could do on your own if you just give it enough effort. I can guarantee you that is not God's will. God is never going to call you to do something that is just within your grasp. He's going to call you to do something that it takes Him to fulfill it. And that's a great way to live. So anyway, you don't need to be afraid of change. You don't want everything to be just static and the same. Man, living a life for God is exciting. You're going to be beyond yourself. You're going to be holding on to God for dear life. You know, I've often described my life just like being in a roller coaster and I'm on that front car and I'm strapped in and holding on for dear life, but I am not driving it, I'm not controlling it. I am just trusting God, and God is leading me to do things that are way, way beyond ourselves. Did you know in just the last 6 years, 5.5 to 6 years, we have spent over $75 million on building a Bible college campus, because that's what God told me to do. And that's way beyond myself. And this is on top of the $3 or $4 million a month I need just to pay my radio and television bills, my staff, all of the materials we send out, our travel, our schools worldwide. On top of all of that, we've spent $75 million debt-free in the last 5.5 to 6 years. And I guarantee you, God is just leading me to do things that are way beyond myself. When we purchased this property up in Woodland Park, Colorado, the sanctuary up there, did you know I didn't have any money? I didn't have the money to do it. And yet since 2009 till 2008, over $75 million has been spent above our normal expenses without going in debt. I'm telling you, that's beyond me. And God has shown me the future. I won't go into all of the details, but I'm estimating that it's going to cost me $100 million or more to finish building this campus and doing all of the things that God has told me to do. On top of that, we've expanded our television outreach. We just made one of the biggest steps in faith that we've ever made, that adds hundreds of thousands of dollars per month to my expenses. And I don't have it at this time. We're trying to finish up these buildings. We're doing all kinds of things. But you know what? It's what God called me to do. And I'm stretching. I'm stretching further than I've ever stretched. And I believe that this is what God has for every one of us. He doesn't have all of you being on television. He doesn't have you building a Bible college campus. But He will stretch you and call you to do something that is beyond your skill sets. If you're only doing what you can do, then I can guarantee you, you've missed God. You got to go beyond yourself. You don't need to fear the unknown. Did you know all of the things that I'm saying would be totally crazy if there wasn't a God who said, trust me and see if I won't come through for you. You know, I'll empower you. I'll bless the work of your hands. You've got so many promises that God is there, that He is drawing you to make a difference. Like this parable that I used, He wants you to take what He has given and multiply and increase and touch people and see the world a better place because of what you've done. Because of all of this, it is not crazy for you to believe and do things that are beyond your ability, because you've got a God who wants to enable you, wants to help you. He wants to get glory out of working through people that in the natural, it's beyond yourself. People look at it and say, it has to be God. You know, I've often told people that if I was God, I wouldn't have chosen me. I'm a hick from Texas. I couldn't look at a person in the face and talk to them. I don't use the best English. My voice, I just had some friends of mine making fun of my voice. This guy was saying that when he first saw me on television, he thought I was trying to imitate Gomer Pyle. I'm telling you, this is the way I normally talk. I'm not faking any of this. If I was God, I wouldn't have chosen me. And yet, I believe one of the reasons God chose me is because when miracles happen, when my son and my wife have been raised from the dead, when we see all of these miracles, financial and all of the things God is doing, people have to look at that and say, that is not that man. That man is not smart enough to do this. You know, I've used this example before, that my mother died in 2009, and right before she died, she asked me to tell her again all of the things that God was doing in the ministry. She was a big part of it, a big supporter of the ministry, and she was being blessed. And as I told her all of the things that were happening around the world and all of the good stuff, she looked at me and she said, Andy, you know this is God. And I said, yes, ma'am, I know this is God. And then she stuck her little bony finger right in my face and she says, you aren't smart enough to do this. And you know what? I agreed 100%. I cannot take credit. The only thing that I have done is like in that roller coaster, I've stayed in my seat. I am strapped in for the ride. I am following God. I haven't aborted. I hadn't bailed. But I can't take credit for what God is doing. I'm telling you, God chooses the weak things of the world, base things of the world, things that are despised, things that are nothing, to bring to naught things that are, and the purpose for that is so that no flesh can glory in His presence. God is going to call you to do something that you aren't qualified to do. And it'll make you depend upon Him, and then when you succeed, He will get all of the credit instead of you, because you aren't smart enough to do this. Man, that's awesome. So I say all of these things to say that you shouldn't fear the unknown. You shouldn't fear change. You know what I fear? Fear is probably not the right word, but I fear just being normal. Man, God didn't call any of us to be normal. You know, anybody can be just like everybody else and go through life and see nothing happen. Man, that would bother me. That would fear. It would cause fear on the inside of me to think that I'm just normal like everybody else. If you've been born again, if you have God on the inside of you, you should be supernaturally. Not just natural, but supernaturally. It ought to be God living through you. I remember some Jehovah's Witnesses coming to my house one time, and anyway, in the process of talking to them, I said things about God is working miracles in my life. And they said, no, God doesn't do miracles. And man, I went around and I could point to everything in our house and tell the miracle of how this came to pass. And anyway, they hit the door running because they don't believe in miracles. But you know what? If you can point to things in your life and say, I did this, this was my hard effort, this was my work, this is all stuff that I've produced, I'm a self-made man or woman. If you can say that, then I can guarantee you, you have missed God's will for your life. God, you need to take the limits off. You need to go beyond yourself. You need to get over into that supernatural realm where if God doesn't come through, you're done for. Man, I enjoy living out on a limb. You know, it's out on a limb where the fruit grows, but yet most people want to be a trunk hugger. Most people don't like change. They don't like the unknown. They want everything to be planned. You know, my wife and I are different from each other. She's like an administrator, and she likes everything just planned out to the max. She will plan a vacation 2 years in advance. And I think she enjoys the planning more than she enjoys going. I'm just the opposite. I like to just go and do things spontaneously and stuff. But there are some people that, my wife, she just does not like change. She would like every day to be the same for the rest of our life and stuff. Well, I'm not quite that bad, but I still don't like the unknown. There is a security and stuff. And so I think that there is just a natural resistance of us beginning to start dreaming big and saying, God, what do you want me to do? Because we like the security of having everything planned out. I've already talked about that. You know, another thing that was a fear with me was a fear of failure. And I think that most people can relate to what I'm saying, but there are people that would rather live a mediocre life and know that I can do this. I can handle this. It's no problem, rather than to stretch themselves and begin to step out with the potential of failure. I think that most of us have been taught to fear failure. We've seen people who fail be ridiculed and spoken down about and stuff, and we just hate the thought of failing, and because of it, there are many people that don't try anything that is beyond themselves because they don't want to fail. You know, Peter, the Lord said, He says, Peter, Satan has desired to have you that he might sift you as wheat, but I have prayed for you that your faith fail not. Most people would think that when Peter denied the Lord 3 times, denied even knowing Him, and swore with an oath, cursed himself if he wasn't telling the truth and stuff, they would think, well, he failed. But Jesus prayed for him that his faith wouldn't fail, and He says, and when you are converted, strengthen your brethren. And so, the point I'm making is, see, most people would say Peter failed, but Jesus prayed that he wouldn't fail and even prophesied that he would be converted and his faith would win out. He might have lost a battle, but he didn't lose the war. What I'm saying is that God doesn't look at failure the way that you and I do. I believe that all of the things that God has put in my heart, I've got hundreds of millions of dollars that I'm going to be spending on a Bible college campus. And man, we just expanded our television into prime time, something that I have been praying for 17 years. And we are expanding in every area. I've already said this once, but the Lord has shown me that 2018 is going to be one of the biggest years that we've ever had in ministry. I'm expecting huge things. And you know what? I believe I'm going to accomplish everything that God puts in my heart. But let me just say that if I was to fail, and if these visions, and if these things don't come to pass, you or someone else might look at me and think, well, he failed. But you know what? I think God would receive me into heaven and say, man, you went for it. You tried. You may not have hit the stars, but you hit the moon. And He would thank me for it. I used this example last week, but it's like a kid riding a bike. When you fall off a bike, your parent doesn't say, you idiot, why didn't you do what I told you to do? No, they get up and compliment you and say, hey, you went 10 feet, try it again. Next time you can go farther. I believe that even if I failed by your estimation, I believe that God would receive me into heaven and say, Andrew, you went for it. I was a person that was so introverted I couldn't look at a person in the face and talk to them. And yet when God called me to preach the Word, I battled through that. And I've battled through a lot of things. And you know what? Even if I don't obtain everything, I believe I am, but if somehow or another I didn't obtain it, I believe God would accept me. So, I say all of this to say that if you're afraid of failure, you're afraid to stretch yourself because you might be a failure, I believe the Lord looks at it. Not that if you try and go ahead and do what He told you to do and it doesn't work out, God doesn't see that as failure. You know what God sees as failure? Are the people that are just sitting there knowing that God has more for them, but you are afraid to step out. You're afraid to take a chance. You're going to play it safe. You don't want to risk anything. I believe that's failure. We need to redefine failure. There are some of you that you're thinking, man, I'm doing good, everything's okay. But you aren't content. You know that there's more. Everything that's in your life is stuff that you were able to do under your own strength and power. And I'm saying this in love, not to condemn you, but to stir you up and motivate you to believe God for more. That you know what? That attitude is failure. When you're afraid to do anything, that's failure. Let me use this example. This is one of my favorite examples from Scripture. But over in 2 Kings chapter 7, there was a famine in Samaria. And it got so bad that people were buying animal dung for huge amounts of money. Matter of fact, in the previous chapter, they had just killed their own children and eaten their children. I mean, they had killed all of the animals, and then now they were eating animal dung. They were turning to cannibalism. It was a terrible situation. And in 2 Kings chapter 7, verse 3, it says, and there were 4 leprous men at the entering in of the gate, and they said one to another, why sit we here until we die? If we say we will enter into the city, then the famine is in the city, and we shall die there. And if we sit here, we die. Also, now therefore come, and let us fall out unto the host of the Syrians. If they save us alive, we shall live, and if they kill us, we shall but die. And the story goes on that when they went to the Syrian camp, the Lord had caused the Syrians to hear a sound like chariots and horses and a war sound, and the people fled in fear. They left their fires still going, their food was there, they left their coats, their clothes, their gold, everything, and they just fled. And so when these 4 leprous men got to the camp of the Syrians, instead of being killed, potentially killed by them, they went in and they had been starving, and now they had all of this food prepared, food that was still cooking. They ate until they couldn't eat anymore. And they took all of the raiments, they took all of the gold, they took silver, they went and buried some. They did all of this. They went from famine to feast. They went from being outcasts, leprous men that weren't even allowed in the city. They had to sit outside and they were just watching them starve to death. They went from being zeros to being heroes in just a matter of hours. They went back and told the city of Samaria what had happened, and the king sent out, searched it, and all of a sudden the famine was over, and these guys who had been zeros were now heroes, and all because they said, how long are we going to sit here? Until we die? If we sit here, we're going to die. If we go into the city, if we go backwards, we're going to die. The only thing is to go forward. And there is a potential of death. They were going to go expose themselves to the enemy. And the enemy could have killed them. And that was a real possibility. But they said it's the only chance we've got. If we sit here, we're going to die. If we go into the city, we're going to die. The only chance is to go expose ourselves to the Syrians. And if they kill us, we just die. We're going to die anyway. Do you know this is impeccable logic? If you looked at your options, and if you weren't emotionally involved and you were just thinking, what is the best chance of survival? This is absolutely the best chance of survival. They would die if they go into the city. They were going to die if they stood there. But if they went out there, they ran the risk of being killed, but it was the only chance they had of overcoming this. And I mean, it turned out to be a great deliverance. Did you know that there is a comparison here between this and what many of you are experiencing? You know that things aren't right. You're actually dying emotionally. You're watching, time go by. This is not a dress rehearsal. Every day that the sun comes up, you're either getting closer to what God has told you to do, or you're just burning daylight. You're wasting time. And you know things aren't going right, and you're losing heart. If you stay where you are, things are never going to change. If you turn and run the other direction, retreat, things aren't going to change. The only chance you've got to reach your full potential is to just take a leap, to take a step. Get out there and begin to trust God. Begin to say, God, what is your purpose for my life? And then as God shows you something, go for it. But there's so many people that are afraid of failure, they just won't do it. If these 4 leprous men had been so petrified by the possibility of them being killed, they wouldn't have ever done this, and they wouldn't have experienced their own supply, and they wouldn't have experienced God using them to literally break the famine and the siege of the city of Samaria. I'm telling you, you've got to overcome a fear of failure. I'm doing so many things right now. I'm not going to take the time to tell you, but I'm doing things right now that in the natural probably don't look smart. Let me just give you one thing that, I've mentioned this in the past, that over the last 5.5 to 6 years, we've spent $75 million on buildings, and we've done it debt-free. And this is on top of our normal operating expense, which is millions of dollars per month. And so we have been just stretched to the max. And then, man, I could go into more detail on this, but last year we had an additional 336 acres adjacent to our Bible College campus in Woodland Park that the owners came and made me a deal that I've talked to them before, and I said I'm not going to go in debt. And so anyway, they offered it to us debt-free. They said if you would just make payments like a lease payment, then there will be no interest. Every penny will go towards the purchase. No indebtedness. And they gave me a special clause that if something was to happen, like if I was to be killed in a plane crash or, worst case scenario, that we could just walk if we want. That probably wouldn't be the smart thing to do, but we could. We could just walk, and there's no obligation. I mean, it's as debt-free. It's like paying rent, and at the end of a certain period of time, you own the house. And so I did that. And because of that, it just stretched us to the max. And then in January of 2018 is when we actually took possession of this property and of this building, and there's a $1.5 million renovation that has to happen on this building before my staff from in the Colorado Springs can move up there. So I've got all of this building stuff, and I've got to have it finished this year. We're pushing to get it finished by the time the 2018-2019 school year starts, and to do that, I've got to put out extra money. We're putting out over $550,000 a month. I actually am going to have to be putting out over $1 million a month on construction. Then we've occupied this property, and I'm paying $133,333.33 a month on that. And then we've got a $1.5 million renovation on that building, and all of these things coming together. In December, I was sitting down and thinking, what can we cut? What can we cut back on? What can we push off into the future? We were trimming things back, and we were living as frugally as we possibly could. And at the end of December, I had something that I've been praying for 17 years come to pass. Ever since I went on television, I've wanted a prime time evening slot. And I'm on prime time on a couple of networks and a couple of individual stations, but they aren't the larger networks. And I am absolutely convinced that if I could get a prime time evening slot, that it would it would reach a brand new segment of people that don't listen. Most of my programming is in the morning. And like on the largest network, I'm on it, I think it's, I'm not sure, but I think it's 5:30 in the morning Eastern time, and by the time you get over to the West Coast, it's like 2:30, 3 o'clock in the morning or something. And so because of it, we haven't had the coverage that we need. And so for 17 years, I've been praying and asking for a prime time evening slot. And anyway, long story, but in the midst of all of this, where I've got all of these expenses going and I am stretched to the max, I feel like a rubber band that if you stretch me anymore, I'm going to pop. In the midst of that, I had the second largest network in the world come and offer me a prime time evening slot, 8 o'clock Eastern time in the evening. And as you step across America, you know, that comes to 5 o'clock in the evening on the West Coast. And I mean, it was just something I've been praying for, but it's going to add hundreds of thousands of dollars per month to my expenses. And you know what? In the natural, it looked like the worst thing to do. And so I told my media buyer and my staff, I said, look, give me some time to pray about this. My first reaction would have been just to say that, you know what, this is bad timing. My media buyer, even when he called me, he says, you probably aren't going to get an opportunity like this again, but he advised against it because of our financial situation. And I've actually had to have some of my vendors, we paid them partial payments and split the payments for cash flow, which is not the way that we should be doing things. And so we were just stretched again to where it looked like we were going to pop if we did anything else. And so everything in the natural said, don't do it. And I told him, I said, well, I probably can't take advantage of it, but let me pray about it. I said I'd call him by the end of the day. And did you know I didn't spend more than just a few minutes praying about this, and the Lord reminded me, don't limit me. He brought me back to that, what He told me in January 2002. And He says, don't limit me. He says, you've been praying for this for 17 years. This is something you've been believing for. It's something that I believe God put in my heart, and it was like a one-time opportunity. And I was going to let it go because I was fearful that this was more than what we could handle. It would have been a fear of failure. And you know what? I didn't spend very many minutes praying about this until I thought, this is God, and I'm going to do it. And I don't have a clue. At the time I'm making these programs, I've only been on this evening time slot for 1 week. And I honestly don't know what the outcome of this is going to be. But I'm just telling you by faith that the money that it takes to get this done is going to come in. I am going to see it come to pass. God told me not to limit Him again. And see, this, I'm relating what happened to me, but this applies to you. There are some of you that you know God is telling you to do something more. You've got a vision in your heart to do something, and you have a fear of failure, a fear that is the provision going to be there, a fear of, can I do these things? And because of it, you're holding back and you're limiting God. Now again, there is wisdom to use. You know, it's not like I've never seen God supply a need. If God would have told me to do what I'm doing, like right now, we really have to have over $4 million a month to pay my bills. I need $5 or $6 million a month. That's what we need to accomplish everything I'm talking about right here. But you know what? If I had never seen God supply $5 for me, I think it would be foolish for me to just launch out and start obligating myself to a $5 or $6 million thing. I'm not talking about doing something foolishly. I've grown. I've seen God supply. I've seen God supply millions of dollars. And so what I'm doing right now is not foolish. It's not just, a leap of faith. It's a calculated step of faith based on things that I've done in the past. So I'm not telling you to just throw caution to the wind and for you to go believe for a $5 million home and you can't even pay your rent things come in the good, the acceptable, the perfect will of God. First the blade, then the ear, and then the full corn in the ear is what it says in Mark chapter 4. There's wisdom to be used. Somebody could misunderstand what I'm saying, but hopefully you're understanding that I just know that God is speaking to some of you, and He's put things in your heart that you are afraid to take advantage of because of a fear of failure. And I'm saying to you, just like these 4 leprous men, how long are you going to sit there until you die? Are you just going to sit there? Are you going to let something that God put in your heart? Again, back to my situation, I prayed for 17 years. God, give me a prime time slot on one of these major networks. I've prayed for 17 years, and then boom, the opportunity comes up at what I consider to be the least opportune time, a very bad time to be expanding and doing that, but it's what I've been praying for, it's what I've been longing for, and now we get the opportunity, and I'm going to turn it down because in the natural it doesn't look good. That would have just been wrong. I just know in my heart, even though I'm making these programs prior to being able to tell you in hindsight what happened, I just know in my heart that this is going to work out, and not only are we going to have the money that it takes to pay for this programming and all of the increased employees and all of the increased materials that we send out and stuff, but I'm going to have excess. It's going to actually be a benefit to me. I'm saying this by faith, but I'm telling you this is what happened. And if you hang around, you can come check on us back in the summer of 2018, and I guarantee you'll see that I'm still on that prime time and things are working and God has worked it out. It'll work. And God is saying to some of you that there are things in your heart that you know God is leading you to do, and you're limiting God because of a fear of failure. You're afraid that things may not work out. You're afraid that God won't come through for you. I'm telling you, you're going to have to break beyond that. Fear limits God. Faith releases and appropriates what God has already done. And I just know in my heart that I'm speaking to people right now that God has put more on the inside of you than what you are experiencing. And you know what? You need to break out. You need to go beyond that fear. You need to trust God. And again, look at things from God's standpoint. Peter didn't fail, even though he denied the Lord 3 times. God didn't consider that a failure. He might have lost the battle, but he didn't lose the war, and he went out with a shout, and I guarantee you, I believe God told Peter, "Well done, you good and faithful servant." It is not a failure to attempt something, even if it doesn't work. At least you tried. There's a lot of people that are trying nothing because they're afraid. And they're thinking that, I just don't want to experience failure. I believe that that is failure. I believe that to do nothing. I believe that to keep your 1 little pound that God gave you and keep it laid up in a napkin and hidden, and then when He returns, you just give Him back what He had already given you and you didn't increase it. That's failure. You can read that in Luke chapter 19. I'm telling you, you need to break out of a fear of failure. And what I'm saying here is based on faith. People who operate in just the natural, if you go to a banker, they aren't going to give you anything on faith. They're going to look at your past performance and they're going to deal with you. And sad to say, most of your friends, even a lot of your Christian leaders, if you go to your pastor, he may sit there and evaluate you on what's happened in the past. But I'm telling you, in faith, you need to stretch out. You need to get over a fear of failure. And you need to go to believing God and taking the limits off God. But let me turn over to Matthew chapter 14, and this is where Jesus came to His disciples walking upon the water. They were in the midst of the sea. There was a terrible storm. The boat was full. It looked like they were going to sink. And in the midst of this crisis situation, Jesus just comes walking to them on top of the very thing that was about to destroy them. And some people take offense when I say this, but I think that if we looked at things from God's standpoint, just like Jesus was walking on top of this storm that was killing them. And what that ministers to me is that Jesus is so awesome. He is so in control that the thing that is about to just crush you and you think that you're overwhelmed, it's no big deal to Jesus. Jesus just walked on top of the very thing that was about to kill these disciples. And I think it helps me when I understand that the things that bother me so much and they look so big to me, they are inconsequential to God. The only reason He's even concerned about it is because it concerns you and because He loves you. But God is not overwhelmed with your problems. He came walking on top of the very thing that was about to kill them. And it says here in Matthew chapter 14, verse 25, and in the fourth watch of the night, Jesus went unto them walking on the sea. And when the disciples saw Him walking on the sea, they were troubled, saying, It is a spirit, and they cried out for fear. But straightway Jesus spake unto them, saying, Be of good cheer, it is I, be not afraid. Now think about this. If all Jesus was wanting to do was to have them be of good cheer and not be afraid, why didn't He just still the storm? Why did He tell them to not be afraid and to be of good cheer before the problem was solved instead of after it? Why didn't He just solve the problem, and then wouldn't they have been of good cheer and not have been afraid anymore? See, this is the way we want it to be. We cry out to God, oh God, change the situation, and we come to Him with all of our fear and with all of our doubt and with all of our unbelief. But the Lord says to you, you be of good cheer and don't let your heart be troubled before the situation is changed. You know what that is? That's faith. You need to respond in faith. God needs some act of faith because it happens according to the power that works in us. Ephesians chapter 3, verse 20. God is able to do exceeding abundantly above all we ask or think. And there's not a period there. It says according to the power that works in us. If there isn't any faith working on the inside of you, God can't move. I know some people take offense and say, oh, God can do anything. Well, you could say God won't move. You can say it any way you want to. I'm telling you, until you take some act of faith, things aren't going to work. It's not because God doesn't have the power, but God has delegated authority to us, and until we act in faith, God can't or won't, will not, whatever you want to say, it's not going to happen until there's an expression of faith on your part. We need to believe God. So He told them, be of good cheer. Instead of solving their problem and then say, now are you of good cheer? No, He told them to be of good cheer in advance. That's faith. And then in verse 28 it says, Peter answered Him and said, Lord, if it be Thou, bid me come unto Thee on the water. And look at the Lord. He said, come. Did you know that this word come would have worked for all of the disciples? But there's only one disciple, Peter, that got out of the boat and walked on the water. I spent quite a bit of time talking about a fear of failure. People knowing that God's wanting them to do something, but they're afraid of failure. They're afraid to get out of the boat. But look at it this way. It says that the boat was now full of water. They were afraid that they were going to drown. Did you know, if you looked at this thing logically and took your emotions out of it, there was very little difference in being outside of the boat in the water and being in the boat. The boat was full of water. It was going down. They were going to drown if they just stayed in the boat. How long were they going to sit there until they died? You know, I used this yesterday out of 2 Kings chapter 7, these 4 leprous men. How long are we going to sit here? Until we die? If we stay here, we're going to die. If we go into the city, we're going to die. Let's go out to the enemy. The worst they could do is kill us. You know, that's impeccable logic. But most people are too emotional to think, oh, they could kill me. Well, you're going to die if you don't do something. You got to do something. You got to take risk. You got to get over a fear of risk and wanting everything to be risk-free. Christian living is risky living. Trusting God is risky living. These guys that were in the boat, if they would have been thinking logically and not emotionally, they wouldn't have been holding on to that boat because that boat was not going to save them. They would have gone down if it hadn't have been for what Jesus did. There was very little difference between being in the boat and being out of the boat. It was going to take a miracle. Peter made the right decision to get out of the boat. Everybody wants this miracle. Everybody would love to stand up and say, man, through Jesus I've walked on water, but you're afraid to get out of the boat. Did you know you aren't going to experience a miracle until you get out of the boat, until you do something different than what everybody else has done? Everybody is wanting different results than what the world is getting, but they don't want to do anything differently. I think it was Einstein that says it's a definition of insanity to want something different and yet be afraid to do anything different. If you keep doing the same thing, you're going to get the same results. If you stay in the boat, you're never going to see the miracle of walking on the water. And yet people are just so afraid to step out. I'm telling you, you've got to get beyond this. You got to get beyond a fear of failure and recognize that, man, I am going to get out of this boat. I'm not going to be like everybody else. It's amazing to me I was driving recently and I drove by a pasture. And I mean, this was when it was warm. And I drove by a pasture and there must have been 20 or 30 cows and they were all huddled together. You couldn't have stood in between any of them. They had this huge pasture and yet, they're just a herd. They have a herd mentality and they stay together. I've heard stories. I've never worked with sheep, but I've heard stories that sheep, just follow the leader and stuff, and that if the leader was to walk off a cliff, the rest of them will just walk right after him and fall off the cliff. It's this herd mentality. And I'm amazed at how people have that same thing. We just follow the crowd. We do what everybody else does, and yet we all want to be individuals. And if somebody groups us and say, that you're in this ethnic group, that you're in this poverty level, we resist all of that. No, I'm an individual, and we claim that we're individuals, and yet we have this herd mentality, and we're afraid to do anything that is different than what everybody else is doing. We want to be just kind of in the middle. You know what being in the middle is? Average. It's just being mediocre. You aren't the best, you aren't the worst. And yet this is where most people live. They just have this herd mentality and want to be like everybody else. And yet they want supernatural results. I'm telling you, if you are going to want different results, you're going to have to do something differently. And I tell our people, when I'm talking to them about coming to Bible college is just one of those things that you can do that I guarantee you is going to turn your life in a different direction. For you to unplug, to leave your home, to leave your job, to leave your friends, your security, and everything that's normal and come to a place and just sit under the Word 4 hours a day, I guarantee you it is a life-changing experience. And if you want something different, then do something different. You keep doing the same thing, you're going to get the same results. I'm thinking about a woman right now, Nicola Appleby, and I've been going to Charlotte, North Carolina for I think it's 32 or 33 years. And Nicola and her mom lived over in Winston-Salem, and they would come over to Charlotte for these meetings every year. And anyway, Nicola, she had a job in a law firm, was making a lot of money. She just, successful in a lot of ways, but every year she would talk to me and the director of our Bible college when we were out there, and she just felt like she should come to Charis Bible College. And yet she was afraid to do so for a number of reasons, not only her job and stuff, but her mother. She lived with her mother. Her mother was dependent upon her, and they shared the rent together. And there was just a number of different things. But every year she would come and talk to us. And finally, I remember telling her just exactly what we said yesterday on our program out of 2 Kings chapter 7. And I said, how long are you going to sit here until you die? Are we going to have this same conversation next year? Are you going to be talking about you wished you could come, but you won't change, but you don't want to change anything that you're doing? And finally, Nicola made that step. And she left North Carolina, came out to Colorado. I don't remember all the details, but I think that her business liked her. I forgot exactly how this worked, but she got a job that was comparable to what she had. I think it was even a better job. Things worked better here. She got on fire. She went to Russia. And she was in our school for a period of time as one of our instructors, and then she separated and started doing her own orphanage ministry and things like this. And Nicola, for the last probably decade or more, has been traveling the world, speaks fluent Russian. God has used her, and she just this last year got married, found her husband. She was, I forget how old, but probably in her 40s, and had never been married. And her life has just turned around, and God is blessing her and using her, and great things are happening. And it all started with her getting out of the boat. If you want to walk on water, you're going to have to overcome the fear of getting out of the boat. You're going to have to quit doing things just like everybody else has done. Just because your family has done it this way for years and they're all telling you that you're crazy, you got to do what God has told you to do. I tell you, what I'm saying is so powerful. It's simple, but it's powerful. And the average person misses it because, again, this herd mentality. We're just afraid to break out. We're afraid to do something different. You don't like what you're having experienced. You don't want to be like everybody else. You don't want to be just mediocre. You want to be different, but you don't want to do anything differently. That's not how it works. You're going to have to take a step of faith. You're going to have to get over being afraid of failure. So Peter, he got out of the boat and he walked on the water to go to Jesus. And in the next verse it says, "But when he saw the wind boisterous, he was afraid, and beginning to sink, he cried, saying, Lord, save me." Did you know, as long as he was looking at Jesus, the author and the finisher of his faith, Hebrews chapter 12, he was able to walk on water. He was able to do the impossible. He was able to do things that he could not do in himself because of faith, because he had a word from God. One word, 4 letters in the English language, come, was enough to do a miracle. All you need is a word from God and to step out of the boat and start doing it, and you can do the impossible. You can do things that you couldn't do by yourself. I'm telling you, if your life isn't supernatural, it's superficial. Man, that's powerful. If your life isn't supernatural, it's superficial. You ought to be living a supernatural life. You ought to be able to look and say, man, God is awesome in my life. And there's a lot of people that you can't say that. You've never gotten out of the boat, and yet you would love to have this testimony. You're going to have to get out of the boat, and you're going to have to keep your eyes on Jesus instead of everything else around you. Did you know when you start following God, it's not going to look good at first? I don't know all the reasons for this. I'm not sure that I can explain that, but I'm telling you, in my own life, God put this vision on the inside of me of reaching the world. And I didn't have a clear vision. I wasn't sure it was television, but I knew that I was going to reach people all over the world. I knew that I was going to have a large ministry, one of the largest ministries in the world, and I was going to reach people. And I believed this from the day one when God touched my life. But did you know that immediately it didn't happen? The very first thing that happened is God told me to quit school. I was in college and I got drafted and sent to Vietnam and sat in a bunker in Vietnam for 13 months. And then I started being a youth director in a little church. Then I pastored 3 little churches, and it was over a decade later that, you know what, I still had this vision of reaching the world, and yet nobody else saw it. And there wasn't any proof of it. I even had relatives. I had people who loved me that meant well, who came up, and every time they talked to me, they basically were saying something like, you know what, you ought to try something different. This isn't working. There was no proof of it. I didn't have the finances. People were staying away from my meetings by the thousands. There was not any physical proof that God was ever going to use me and that I was ever going to touch people all over the world. It looked like I couldn't even get out of town. But I had this vision. And you know how I survived? I kept looking, kept my eyes on Jesus, the author and the finisher of my faith. It's like Peter walking on the water. As long as he looked at Jesus, everything was fine. But when he took his eyes off of Jesus and looked at the circumstances did not bear witness with what he was doing. Did you know that it says when he saw the wind and the waves boisterous, he was afraid, and beginning to sink, he cried, saying, Lord, save me. When he saw the wind and the waves, what did the wind and the waves have to do with him walking on the water? Nothing. He couldn't have walked on the water if it had been a perfectly calm day. But did you know what the wind and the waves did? It took his attention off of Jesus. He got to see in a storm. It put fear in him. He got to realize, he got to thinking about, I'm out here in the middle of a lake, standing on the water. And when he got back into his natural mind, into his own reasoning, when he took his eyes off of Jesus and just started looking at things in the natural, he began to sink. And I'm telling you, this is the exact same thing for us. If I would have, during that first decade after God called me to minister, if I would have looked at things just in the natural, I would have sunk. I wouldn't have made it. I'd have quit. But you know what? I just kept looking at the vision. I kept looking at Jesus. I kept hearing His Word come, and I kept doing what God told me to do. And now, looking back 50 years later, 50 years since God called me to get out of the boat, and I look now, and God's blessing, God is just doing some awesome things in my life. I am so thankful for it. But did you know it all started with me getting out of the boat, and it didn't look good for a long period of time. I just had to keep my eyes on Jesus. And I'm still having to keep my eyes on Jesus, because in the natural, I could sink at any moment. In the natural, if God doesn't come through, I'm saying things, I'm headed in directions, I've made commitments that if God doesn't come through, I'm dead. But notice it says that he, beginning to sink, he cried out to the Lord. I think this is interesting. I've never seen anybody begin to sink in my life. Amen. You know, if you were to step out of a boat and just step onto the water, you wouldn't begin to sink, you'd just sink. He began to sink, which means that he didn't just, go under the water all at once. He just gradually began to sink. And what's significant about that to me is that when you step out and start following the Lord, you don't fail all at once. You take your eyes off of Jesus, you just begin to sink. And if you would recognize that the moment fear starts coming in, the moment you just start using your logic instead of your faith, the moment you see this happen, if you would turn back to the Lord and put your attention back on Him, you won't sink. You may every once in a while recognize you're beginning to sink, but it is manageable. You don't have to be afraid of this. And what he did, he turned his attention to the Lord. And the Lord didn't rebuke him and say, "You idiot, why didn't you trust me?" He did say, "Why, O ye of little faith, why did you doubt?" But he reached out his hand and he picked him up. And I can guarantee you, Jesus didn't put Peter on his back and carry him back to the boat, or he didn't put him in his arms and carry him back. He grabbed Peter and they both walked back to the boat. And then if you read this same account in John chapter 6, it says that when he entered into the boat, immediately the boat and all of the disciples were translated to the other side of the lake. It was just absolutely miraculous. He didn't just let Peter drown. He didn't rebuke him. He reached out and helped him. And I'm telling you that if you would just get over your fear of failure and get out of the boat and take a risk and start moving in that direction, you may not do everything right, but Jesus is right there. And if the moment you begin to start seeing failure, panic come in, unbelief, you just turn to the Lord, put your eyes back on Him, and I guarantee you, you'll make it to the other side. The Lord didn't tell these disciples, get into the boat and go halfway and drown. He said, no, get into the boat and go to the other side. And I'm telling you, whatever God has called you to do, He's not calling you out of Egypt so you can die in the wilderness. He's calling you out of Egypt so He can bring you into the promised land. He's told you to get out of the boat, not so that you can drown, but so that you can walk on water and reach the other side. I believe that Jesus is speaking to people through these programs and encouraging you to take the limits off, to start believing for big things. Let your imagination go. Sit down and think, if I didn't have money problems, if I wasn't disqualified through my lack of experience and skills, if it wasn't for the people who were criticizing me, just take all of the things that hinder you and sit down and say, what would I do if there were no limitations? If money was no object, skill was no object, people's opinion was no object, what would you do? There's some of you right now that know you have a dream in your heart, but you don't let it surface because you are letting money tell you it can't happen, people tell you it can't happen, your own failures tell you. You just need to put all of this aside. What would I do if there were no restrictions on me? And then when that vision becomes clear, just get out of the boat and go for it. Man, that's awesome.
We hope your heart has been quickened by hearing the Word of God through this message. It's the faithful support of people like you who make this ministry possible. we invite you to prayerfully consider becoming a partner with Andrew Wommack Ministries. We maintain a website at awmi.net. Our helpline number is 719-635-1111, or you can write us at P.O. Box 3333, Colorado Springs, Colorado 80934. Until next time, we pray that you'll reach out by faith and receive everything that's yours through God's grace.